Hey everybody, my name is Darryl and this is Dion.
Hello.
Welcome to DuoQueue. In this video, we're discussing the Silent Gaming Protagonist. Now that we're queued up and ready to go, let's get started with our definition of a Silent Gaming Protagonist and some examples to follow. Dion?
So, I think it's a good idea to start with the definition before we go through a detailed discussion on this. So, from playing different video games, our definition of a silent protagonist is one who doesn't use words during the full course of the games. And they can grunt, they can emote, but recognizable words typically aren't used or very few. And I say the very few because there's an example we have that meets that. So that's how we're looking at it from a silent protagonist perspective. So a little bit about the origin of this. From my research, one of the bigger origins, and maybe there's something smaller that used it first, except for, not including games that are, I guess, completely silent, like an RPG, Final Fantasy, something like that. Nintendo seems to be one of the bigger, I guess, companies that use this technique a lot. Link is intentionally silent in all games, every single one of them, because you're a character that links to him. Mario is who I didn't even think about as silent, but because he goes, "Mamma Mia, it's Mario," but typically, he's a silent and he kind of reacts to different situations, but he doesn't talk. And Samus, who I don't have a lot of experience playing as, but Samus is also a silent character.
She's typically silent.
Typically.
Not recently.
The baby, and the baby, or the baby, of the baby, or the baby.
But typically silent.
Silent, exactly. Or from an origin standpoint, Nintendo was a big user of this experience that just wasn't. And when I say that, I'm really specifically saying when games started having voice acting and stuff like that, they maintained the silent protagonist, right? They kept that. So they kind of originated that in that sense. They're part of the bigger pieces. Other examples, Darryl, why don't you give us a few examples of your experience running through games?
Sure. Some other examples of silent protagonists in video games that I've played or other people might be familiar with would be like Byleth in Fire Emblem Three Houses, as well as Joker in Persona 5. Although they're the kinds of silent protagonists that talk during combat, but don't talk so much in cutscenes. Byleth, for narrative reasons, doesn't speak a lot or show much emotion to begin with in cutscenes. But Joker, while not a chatterbox, does show a lot of personality. You also have Hero from Dragon Quest XI, aka the Luminary. He's silent. I find that to be more of a traditional reason, but he still counts as a silent protagonist, obviously, since he doesn't speak. Mm-hmm. But then you've also got your created characters, like your characters from Skyrim or any Elder Scrolls game, really, your characters in MMOs like Final Fantasy XIV, and your characters in something like, say, Dark Souls and whatnot, created characters in general that don't speak. But we'll get into how they're implemented and how well they're implemented later. For now, first let's talk about why developers choose to use silent protagonists to begin with. Dion, if you want to head that part off.
So there's multiple, there's probably multiple opinions, and this is, our thoughts from our experience, not from creating games ourselves, right?
Yep.
So link games to characters. So if you're making a character, if you're going to be a part of that, they want you to take over that character and be that character, right? So they wouldn't want to make you have that character talk, because then it's not you. But if you're kind of doing that, you feel like you're that character more so, because you can give them your own voice. You can kind of do all of that when you're reading the dialogue of what you might say, or think of what you might say if you're into that. It's more common with creating your own characters, but another good example is Link, right? Link's name comes from the fact that he's a link to you. So you're putting yourself in that character, and that's why he doesn't talk. That's the classic reason. So, there's always that choice. And they want to give gamers a false sense of agency, I guess, have some control over who that character is. And by not assigning a voice, you get that agency, which I think is very interesting. Some other thing is, we could talk a little bit further, some tradition, just that's how the game or fan base thinks of it.
Yeah. Sometimes tradition is why a character doesn't speak in general, even when you can totally give them a voice actor. And sometimes that's because that's the vibe of the game or the direction they decided to go. Like with what you said about Link being a Link to you rather than you are Link, Link is you. You know, Link is you instead. Link is us. And we are not Link. That's the point I'm trying to make. Sometimes stuff like that is intentional, and in the developer's mind, it doesn't need to be changed. The same can be said for Hero in the Dragon Quest series, regarding the fact that it's just tradition. It's not as deeply rooted, it seems, as, say, Link's reasoning, but I'd say personally that tradition has a lot to do with it. Either way around, it would be weird and jarring to fans if Link and Hero, or any character that was traditionally silent for a long running series of games, suddenly started talking. Now, a company may want to give those characters a voice, but that might end up backfiring on them because players already have an idea of how these characters sound and behave in their head.
Mm-hmm.
And if you decide to give that character a voice that doesn't match what they have in their head, you can get some problems. You just have the opposite effect that they're going for. Because that would then pigeonhole the character and put them in one space, maybe multiple, but typically just one space that the players either have to accept or be upset about. So if I'm jumping a little further, let's take someone like Joker from Persona 5, for example. Joker already has a personality instilled into him. You just don't hear it a lot because he doesn't voice it. But you can see it on his face, you can see it in the way he moves in the standard. He's a newer character to the Persona series, not a long-running one. So you can get away with doing that with a new character. Older characters that are mostly neutral at best the whole time, if you suddenly give them a determined personality that doesn't feel like it would match how fans view them, then again, like I said before, you're gonna have some problems.
Yeah, and it's almost like, if you think about it, it's almost like how you read a book or
a manga or something like that.
Or read a manga, and you assign, so I think the book's even stronger, but manga, at least you have pictures, but you assign a personality to the character, or a sound or a voice. And then if you ever really notice, if you go back and watching maybe a movie or an anime of that manga, then you start thinking, if you're reading further into chapters, then you start thinking that voice when you're reading it. So you get that opportunity to come up with a voice. And that's what they're trying to capture in the living up to and losing a tradition, or to make you take care of that character. Some other examples of classics that do this: Hero, Dragon Quest, classic, always did this. Not that they did do voice acting recently, but not in their main character. And then, of course, we talked about Zelda. That's just how the game is set. It's always been that way, and they're not planning on changing it as far as I know. Maybe one day. Another final reason would be budget. And this is obviously in games where they're making lots and lots of money. They have a big backer. They have a producer. That's not the problem. But with games with limited options, which has a slighter budget, voice acting is very, very expensive. Always has been, right? So you can get away with not having voice acting, or having less voice acting on the main character, because it requires, if it's a custom character, they got to come up with all these different voice actors, right? They got to come up with 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 voice actors to match what you created and get a voice. And they got to voice every sound, every voice, every single line in the game they have to read. So if it's a long narrative game, you lose that opportunity, versus not giving you that, and then they can give you more options to customize your character. So the budget also plays, I believe, a pretty big role.
Right. Not to mention when you have games like, say, Fallout New Vegas, where the game is entirely voiced with the exception of your character, the text-based approach really takes precedence. Thanks to a lot of your choices in the game being text-based, there isn't an actor that has to read them or anything like that. And don't get me wrong, they still have to pay actors to react to what you say and whatnot, but, the less voice acting that you have to pay for, the better. Mm-hmm. And this would make dialogue options and choices that you can make a bit more varied. That said, we could actually toss the main character for the Fallout series, with the exception of 4 and maybe 76. I didn't play 76, but we could toss the main character of the Fallout series into the traditional section as well, since traditionally that character is silent. But make no mistake, if companies had the time and the budget, both financially and, well, everything else coupled with budget for a game studio, if they had that kind of time and budget for it, It's entirely possible to do the exact same thing with text-based speech for the main character exclusively or others, or have the entire cast voice. If they had an unlimited budget for both time and money and whatnot, then there's no doubt that you can have all the dialogue options you could possibly get. But sometimes you gotta cut corners to make your deadlines. And sometimes that means your character doesn't have a voice and you gotta make up for that somehow, at least in my opinion. All in all, it really comes down to what kind of game you're making and how you're making it and what your budget is looking like overall.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I agree, 100%. Let's move on to talking about a few good implementations and bad implementations, and that's, of course, is all our opinion. Matter of fact, Darryl might actually disagree with me once he reads these. So let's go into them. So let's start with the good. Always start with good things first. I'm going to talk about Master Chief. Master Chief.
I disagree.
Master Chief is a good implementation within the Halo series, I argue. So I'm a person specifically that does not like going with a silent protagonist. I think in most cases it takes away from the game. The games that I notice it are the ones that I think are bad implementations. Games that I don't even think about it. I didn't even think about Master Chief until I started doing my research, and I'm like, you're right, Master Chief is silent. He barely says anything except for maybe a word at the end of the game, right? So he's not very wordy.
The fact that you can't see his face either really helps.
Yeah. So he was the strong silent type, and that fit the character because of the world he lived in, and the other characters really, they personified that, right? They let him be that way. They always wanted him to do the hardest task. They always went to him. Oh, they're like, oh, it's Chief, we're good. You know what I mean? So it really fit. And then when he said a couple words at the end of the game, it was always a big moment. They always made it so huge, and they used that whole silent protagonist to really lay into that. I thought it was a great implementation. It never even hit my mind that he was a silent protagonist.
That, and coupled with the fact that he doesn't talk a lot, really does make you feel like you are Master Chief. You know he's Chief. Everyone refers to him as Chief. He talks occasionally, reminding you that, hey, he may be you, but technically he's more like, well, he's his own character. But having that absence of facial features on top of the fact that he's silent a lot of the time really makes you feel like you're the one in his gear. Going back to Joker, I talked a lot about him before, but Joker really has that kind of personality and whatnot that you'd expect in a character that is voiced, but he's not. Joker is an avatar for you. You can even change his name and whatnot, but you can tell at the very beginning of the game when you get the very first cinematic, when you're breaking into one of the palaces that take place later in the game, and you just see this guy with like maximum swag turned on. I hate saying swag. It's dialed up to 11 and he's just going for it. This guy oozes personality despite rarely saying a word. You also get a sense of his personality because sometimes he'll do things proactively. And while you get to make a choice for him as he's doing it, he's still the one who initiated the action. So really, you're playing a character that is a representation of you, but you're really controlling a character with a predetermined personality and thought process. And that extends into your dialogue options as well.
So you're saying Joker is a good implementation, right?
Yes, I'm saying Joker is a good implementation. Much like Master Chief, you can project yourself onto Joker, and while he has a determined personality and whatnot, much like Chief does, Chief is a badass and not a coward. Joker has excessive swagger and all that. While they have their own personality traits and whatnot that are predetermined, you can still project yourself onto them and connect with them. And to some extent, that could be said about MMOs as well with the created characters that you have, but that's a much more varied territory, since typically, even in a game like Final Fantasy XIV, where I felt more connected with my character and who my character is and whatnot in regards to the story, that character is still a vehicle. They don't really have much of a personality. They do have things that they do like and don't like to do based on what's happened to them in the narrative, yes, but otherwise they are very much just a vehicle for you to get from point A to point B, and you in real life are the one who's really experiencing everything, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and everyone plays on it in Final Fantasy as well. I actually do not like the Final Fantasy implementation, but I know a lot of people do, and I get it. It's actually not one of our examples here. Maybe it should have been.
Another example of one that's neither good nor bad, that's more varied, and whatnot, if I can say this real quick, would be the protagonist, or you, in Monster Hunter Rise. In Monster Hunter Rise, your character talks, whereas in older games, I can't speak for all of them, but I know in World, your character doesn't talk. You technically don't talk in Rise either, but you do talk in the middle of combat or with certain call-outs and whatnot that you make to your companions and stuff like that. That can be a little jarring because, at least for the dub, the voices don't necessarily match the situation all the time, at least not in my mind, because it can be kind of on the weak side. Like, some people might view their hunter as a badass who's really gruff and this and the other. And when you hear your hunter going carve, 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 woohoo, here I go, it can throw you off. A lot of the time, all in all, it's based on how you perceive your created character and whether or not your created character matches what you designed and what you have in your head. And the game has to give you the tools to do that. So what you end up with could be a mixed bag. The balance between good implementation and bad implementation when it comes to silent protagonists it's a wide spectrum and a tricky one to balance. Speaking of bad implementations, let's talk about bad implementations.
Bad implementations. You obviously gave Monster Hunter Rise as an example of bad. I also think Dragon Quest XI is a bad protagonist, and there's a reason. And it's so you know why they did it, right? You know they did it because that is the classic way to do a Dragon Quest game. Silent protagonist. My issue with the Dragon Quest XI silent protagonist is your character is someone with personality. It is not you. He's supposed to be you, I think, but you don't customize him. He has a style. He has a look. He has a fighting style. I mean, he has everything. So he needs to fit into the game.
He's also a blank slate, and
yes.
Sorry to cut you off. The problem with him being a blank slate is he doesn't have much of a personality to him, and you also don't have a lot of agency with him. Unlike Joker, who is silent with the exception of when he's in combat and a couple of times in cinematics and whatnot, the luminary / hero doesn't have any real input on the game outside of yes and no, at least from what I can remember. This is unlike Joker, who you have dialogue options almost all the time in Persona. So even if Joker didn't have a personality, at the very least you had more than yes and no to say, even if it was just, false agency, as you said before.
Yeah.
The same can be said for a created character, like in the likes of Final Fantasy XIV, where you can make a snide remark at Y'shtola, and then she'll chew you out for it. It may not have a bearing on the story, but it was funny, and you can remember that. I don't remember a majority of the conversations I had with characters as the Luminary, because they kind of just talked at me. And I just said yes or no, and even if I said no, they say something like, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you correctly. You meant yes, right? And they have you pick again. So you're kind of just following this train that you have no control of, or not even a false sense of being able to control.
Yeah. And I think, it's almost the opposite of Joker, right? Because Joker had a lot of personality as a silent protagonist. Like, you have emotes and stuff. You just didn't get that in Dragon Quest. You just didn't get it. It was just like, why did you... you could have eliminated the hero and the game would have been the same. And that's the problem. He doesn't exist.
Well, with the exception of the fact that he's still the Luminary.
Well, that's true.
And with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up and talk about our final thoughts regarding silent protagonists. If you want to go first, Dion.
My preference is to not have games with silent protagonists at this day and age, because there is an ability to give everyone a voice. We have made it there, but I understand. I do understand the budget concerns. And I do understand from an indie perspective too, where having silent protagonists could be used, but they could also make everyone silent because of the budgeting or how it has to go. But I do think there is enough good implementations of a silent protagonist, giving that character emotion so you can connect to them either way, and maybe giving you dialogue options and stuff like that, that I would argue there are enough opportunities to make a good silent protagonist, and we can continue getting that. Even in 2021, 2022, 2027, I think there's always going to be a space to have a silent protagonist, and it doesn't have to be bad. And that, I have to say, is enjoying. It's a different perspective than I had in the beginning when I was writing this. So that's awesome.
And I'd like to say that I agree with Dion overall, that these days protagonists should generally be voiced, but I think that's that really depends on the kind of game you're making and what kind of game it is and whatnot, and where a developer's going with it, because I still like having a silent protagonist when I do have one, so long as they're done right. Like, I didn't even bring up Dead Space and how Isaac used to be a silent protagonist himself until the second game when he got a voice and whatnot, because that's just the atmosphere they wanted. That's how they wanted you to feel. They wanted to make it feel like you're the one in Isaac's suit. You're the one going through all of this. And while Isaac is his own character with his own motivation for being there, if Isaac were a chatterbox and they played their cards wrong, then that would have been a problem. Thankfully, they didn't do that in the second game, so it's all good. But again, to reiterate, I am completely fine with silent protagonists so long as they are done well and fit the world they're in, or we have the amount of agency we need to really feel like we're a part of something bigger rather than just along for the ride in a body that doesn't express anything. I'm looking at you, Luminary. As Dion said, there are enough examples of how to do this right if you're going to do a silent protagonist, but there are also just as many examples of ways you could do it wrong. It's, again, as I said earlier, a delicate balance that you have to maintain. Don't underestimate the power of having a voiced character, but especially don't underestimate the power of silence.
Alrighty, I think that's all we've got for now. Thank you all for stopping through to listen here at DuoQueue. Don't forget to comment, share, and leave a like. Next time you're waiting for a party or searching for a lobby, feel free to tune in again while you wait. See you guys later.
Later. What? Did you expect me to say something?